Welcome to the T3 Raider Roots podcast. Before beginning with the new content, I would like to issue correction. Although I did properly identify Eddie Erdelatz as the first coach of the Raiders, I also indicated that Marty Feldman had replaced him 2 games into the 1961 season. I did not properly acknowledge that Feldman coached the team throughout 1961 and 5 games into the 1962 season when he was replaced by Red Conkright, who then guided the team through the rest of the 1962 season. Now, having said all that, let's move into episode 6 of the T3 Raider Roots podcast. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his legendary I Have a Dream speech to a crowd of over 200,000 people in Washington, D.C. In a landmark Supreme Court case, Gideon versus Wainwright ruled that all criminal defendants have a right to counsel. And a large percentage of the nation lost its innocence as President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. But in a city called Oakland, California, a struggling professional football team entering its 4th season was about to start anew, led by a young coach with intelligence, innovation, determination, and the will to win. His name, Al Davis. Welcome to episode 6 of the T3 Raider Roots podcast. I am your host, T3 Raider Facts. In previous episodes, we've spent some time looking at the Chargers and the Texans and the Oilers, as well as the Raiders. Now, with Al Davis at the helm, we will begin to focus our attention squarely on the East Bay and what is about ready to unfold. So sit back and see how Al Davis begins to operate as the head man in charge. Before Al Davis came to Oakland, the Raiders were losing both games and money at an alarming rate. When Davis took over as head coach and general manager, he brought new ideas and new energy to the young squad. One of his first goals was to build an intimidating team image that reflected the city's outsider status, sitting in the shadows of San Francisco, the favored child of the Bay Area. He did this by outfitting his players in new uniforms. He abandoned the old hand-me-downs, the old white and black threads with a little bit of gold trim and a plain black helmet with no logo. Instead, he brought in the colors silver and black, which was a nod to the legendary Black Knights of the Hudson, the famed teams of the U.S. Military Academy, although he substituted silver for the gold. Because of Oakland's image and the type of team that Al wanted to build, the bond was natural. To begin forging the Raiders' brand, Davis centered on the logo, a shield with crossed swords and a raider or pirate wearing an old-time football helmet. "We all believe in the patch logo," Davis said. He continued, "Just like Disney says Mickey Mouse is the symbol of the entertainment world, I believe that this is the patch of the sports world. I believe the Raiders are global." Davis, who was colorblind and who really liked the colors black, white, and silver, was truly ahead of his time in terms of both branding and marketing. He was a non-practicing Jew who, while growing up in Brooklyn, studied the way Adolf Hitler had conquered Europe. It wouldn't be fair to say Davis admired Hitler, but Davis did have a military mind, and he did admire the bold planning and execution of the German Blitzkrieg. He translated this kind of aerial bombardment into his vision of what constituted the most effective form of football warfare, the vertical game, which he's alluded to many times over the years. Tom Flores was Al Davis's first starting quarterback, and veteran All-Pro Cotton Davidson was his backup. Speedy and powerful Clem Daniels was converted to halfback. The ends were Art Powell and Bo Roberson, and rookie Ken Hirock was drafted out of West Virginia to take over as the team's new tight end. Powell, a deep threat receiver, was signed personally by Al after having played out his contract in New York. Flores and Powell would go on to hook up for 16 touchdown passes over the course of 14 games, which was unheard of, as Davis would say. On defense, rookie defensive tackle Dave Costa from Utah was brought in as a defensive tackle. He would go on to be a Pro Bowl selection and solidify the already established notion that Davis had an eye for young talent, the style of football that produced a lot of fireworks and a lot of points. With no agreement between the AFL and the NFL, drafted players often went to the highest bidder. Davis could not hope to outbid the NFL, so he drafted players with remaining college eligibility, hoping that he could sign them once they finished their collegiate careers. Without a number 1 draft choice in 1963, his hopes of success rested on whatever trades he could make and his ability to find the right guys who'd been cast off by other teams. On his talent hunt, he picked up free agent kicker Mike Mercer, linebacker Clancy Osborne, offensive tackles Frank Uso and Proverb Jacobs. He traded veteran tackle Dick Klein and guard Bob Mishak, and bought the contract of defensive back Claude Hoot Gibson from the San Diego Chargers, his old team. These were all serviceable, experienced players who could fill in for a couple of years while Al began to assemble the team that he really wanted. Al wanted the players and his coaches to see what he saw. He was big on implementing graphs and charts during team meetings and used chalkboards and view graphs, the forerunner of the modern overhead projector, which he continued to use right up until his very last press conference. "I'm hooked on graphics," he said. "I've always believed in putting something on the blackboard and you leave it up there. A lot of players in team meetings are a little reluctant to ask questions because of fear of being razzed. But after the session, they'll come up and point to something and ask about it because it's still on the board." That was a different way of teaching than most people were doing. Plus, I used a view graph, projecting a page on a screen, and you read the material right along with them. "Please read that to the class," I would say, and it's big up there on the screen. I hate small print. It makes it difficult to read and comprehend. Just for the record, in his later years, Davis preferred everything in an 18-point bolded font. In his new dual role as head coach and general manager, Al oversaw all facets of the Raiders' business operations, including signing all the checks, a practice he continued for many, many years. People who were living in the East Bay and who had grown up with the 49ers as their only option for professional football now had their own team to rally behind. Yet Davis, the administrative leader of the Raiders, rarely went out into the community to drum up local support. He didn't believe in wasting his time making speeches and spreading faith among the citizens of the community. In Al's own words, "You can talk your head off at luncheons and dinners, but it won't do a thing for business unless your team wins. The same guys that tell you what a fine job you're doing for the community will be the first to stop coming to games when you start to lose. So I concentrate my energies on coaching the team. I gamble everything on our ability to hold our own in our league." As Davis addressed his team, he told them, "Poise is the answer. Pride and poise. Wherever you go, you are the Oakland Raiders. Anybody who is ashamed of that can get an airplane ticket right now. I don't care who you are or what you've done. You're here now, and you're going to win, win, win." What he didn't tell the team, but what he keenly knew, was that despite all the grand comparisons that were made between Davis and dominant military figures, some of that would have amounted to anything. None of it would have amounted to anything if Davis had not succeeded in a big way. In this respect, he did live up to the genius label that owner Wayne Valley had tagged him with. Al Davis's way was successful. There was little luck involved. He had the vision, he implemented it, and he instilled the will to win. The Raiders had suffered through 3 losing seasons and had only amassed 3 wins over the past 2 in 1961 and 1962. If Davis had been a failure and the team had continued its downward slide, sports history would have been much different. The Raiders franchise would have probably either folded or moved to another city. The Oakland Alameda County Coliseum would not have been built. The AFL might not have survived, merged with the NFL, and become the model of sports success that it became. The A's baseball team would never have moved to Oakland, and neither would the NBA's Golden State Warriors. Oakland would never have been known as the home of champions. On the gridiron, Al's philosophy was that he was going to stretch the field vertically. When his team came out of the huddle, he didn't want first downs. He didn't want to move the chains. He wanted touchdowns. He wanted the big play, the quick strike. He said, "They tell quarterbacks, take what they give you. That all sounds good to everybody, but I always went the other way. We're going to take what we want." What Davis designed was not a reckless use of the long bomb, but a controlled, disciplined means for getting the long ball into the end zone. And he made it so that opposing defenses were always on their heels. They may not have known exactly when that bomb was coming, but they knew that it was coming. The defensive theory evolved early on in the 60s. Number one was pressure. He wanted to put pressure on the pocket, put pressure on the quarterback, diversification of defense, and utilization of the corners and a bump and run principle. And the idea was to disrupt the flow and the continuity of the offense. With the new look and the new attitude, the Silver and Black opened the 1963 season on the road in Houston to face the team that had won the first 2 league championships, the Houston Oilers. Ironically, the person who put up the first points against him was the Oilers kicker, who would later go down in Raiders lore as one of the toughest and most fearless competitors in the game, George Blanda. Even so, the Raiders shook off the deficit and came back to defeat the Oilers 24-13 before a stunned crowd of nearly 25,000 people. During the game, the team was called for 17 penalties, totaling 158 yards. Still, they managed 328 yards in total offense, including an 85-yard touchdown bomb to receiver Art Powell. Many people thought this victory was just a fluke. But then the Raiders returned home the following week and before a nearly capacity crowd of over 17,000 people, defeated the Buffalo Bills 35-17. Once more, the crowd was wowed with a long pass play for a touchdown as quarterback Cotton Davidson connected with Clem Daniels on a 73-yard scoring strike. The Raiders were now 2-0, and the team had captured the imagination of the Bay Area as well as a growing legion of fans throughout California. In week 3, another crowd of well over 17,000 greeted the hometown Raiders as they took on the Boston Patriots. In a game that looked like a potential blowout, but not in a good way, the Raiders came back from a 20-0 deficit and closed it to 20-14 before time ran out. Al Davis had endured his first loss as a Raiders head coach. Even so, the team was 2-1 and getting ready to embark on a 3-week East Coast road swing. For the first time, the Raiders flew charter. They had a whole plane to themselves. Before 1963, the Raiders had flown commercial on DC-6s, 4-engine prop planes. If they made a trip to Buffalo, they would have to stop first in Chicago to refuel. The trip would take most of the day, but now they were flying nonstop on prop jets, and they were flying now out not of San Francisco, but out of Oakland, and there was a lot of pride in that. Under Al Davis, the Raiders became first class, and the ownership went along with it. Still, Al had to put the owners in their place. Al inherited a pretty loose bunch when he took over as coach and GM. Heading to the airport after a game, win or lose, the bus would stop at a liquor store to pick up beer. The coaches approved, even though they were losing most of the time. Al invited some owners along on the trip. When the owners made the usual bus stop to get beer for the players, Al heard about it and he was livid. After that, he wouldn't let the owners travel with the players for a long time. And it wasn't because Al didn't drink. He based his actions merely on public safety. He didn't want the players drinking on the plane, then getting into their cars at the airport and possibly causing an accident. The road trip had been tough, facing the Jets, the Bills, and then the Patriots again. They lost all 3 contests and returned to Oakland with a record of 2-4. Returning home, the fan base was actually excited, despite the fact that the team was on a 4-game losing streak. People started to flock to this new wide-open style of football. Even so, as they returned home, the San Francisco media was delighted that the Raiders were losing. They reported that the Raiders had deluded themselves into believing they were winners, when in truth, they were still just the same old clown dressed up in a new costume. Davis didn't buy into all the media hype. He kept selling the players on this new concept, pride and poise. He loved mottos, and he relished the fact that even though the team had lost 4 games in a row, it was only by a combined 27 points. The team wasn't getting blown out or dominated by opposing teams. One reason for that is that the Raiders had better players. Under Al, the organization no longer cut costs on personnel, and Davis made intelligent trades. He picked up linebacker Archie Matsos and wide receiver Art Powell, as mentioned earlier, 2 players that helped right away, and Clem Daniels, the star running back, and who had suffered a deep leg bruise and saw limited action during the road trip, jump-started the team offensively. Remarkably, the Raiders didn't lose any other games for the rest of that first season under Al Davis. The 8-game winning streak started with an astounding performance by Daniels against the New York Jets. He ran for 200 yards and also scored on a 56-yard pass play. The Raiders won the game 49-26. Despite their success, NFL partisans and many in the media disparaged the AFL as a Mickey Mouse league. That's how Tex Mull of Sports Illustrated referred to it. Even up to the time that the AFL began competing in Super Bowls, he described their brand of football as, quote, basketball on cleats, unquote. But in 1963, the Raiders continued to win. The league was then faced with a different dilemma. On November 22nd, President John F. Kennedy was gunned down by an assassin in Dallas, Texas. Oakland was scheduled to play in Denver 2 days later. The owners had an emergency meeting to debate whether or not to go on with the games. Davis called Milt Woodard in the AFL commissioner's office and told him, "No way, we're not going to play. It would be a travesty." His attitude, joining the rest of the country in mourning over the president's death, prevailed. The NFL, on the other hand, played its slate of games. NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle had been advised by President Kennedy's secretary, Pierre Salinger, who was also a longtime personal friend, that the president would have wanted the games to be played. So the NFL went on with its games as scheduled. The public responded in anger and praised the AFL for doing the right thing. Oakland shifted its game against the Broncos to Thanksgiving Day, and the Raiders won again. The Silver and Black also defeated San Diego not once, but twice. The Chargers couldn't handle the receiving threat of Powell. In their first meeting, Powell caught a 20-yard scoring pass from Tom Flores early in the game. Later in the fourth quarter, he fought through double coverage and hauled in a 46-yard touchdown pass from Cotton Davidson. Davis had been alternating quarterbacks most of the season. Davis was concerned about putting too much pressure on Tom Flores, his starting quarterback, who was still receiving post-illness treatment for his tuberculosis after missing the entire 1962 season. The contest was a thriller, and the Raiders came from behind to defeat the Chargers 34-33. It was their first win ever over the Chargers. Oakland proved the upset was no fluke when they beat San Diego again 41-27. People assumed that Davis got a special kick out of beating his old team. What they came to realize, however, is that Davis didn't care who the opponent was. He just wanted to win. When the Raiders beat Houston at home to cap a 10-4 season, they had achieved the greatest single-season turnaround in pro football history. Despite their 2 wins over San Diego, the Chargers had a better record by 1 game at 11-3, and they went on to win the AFL title that year, their best year ever as a franchise. Named AFL Coach of the Year, Davis was invited to come to Corpus Christi, Texas for a college postseason game between players from Texas and a group of varsity players from around the country. Davis was put in charge of the national squad, which gave him a chance to get a jump on scouting talent. The game was called the Challenge Bowl. One of the players there was a huge offensive lineman from Nebraska who would go on to enjoy a 10-year career with the Raiders, capped by selection into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. His name was Bob Brown. Another player on the squad was a tackle from Wichita State who spoke with a New Jersey accent that was very familiar to Al. On the second day of practice, this kid broke his hand. The next day, the kid was on the sidelines with his hand in a cast. When Al asked him why he wasn't on the practice field, the kid said, "I can't practice with this big cast on my hand." "You don't practice," David said. "You don't play. I'm sending you home." "No, I want to stick around," the player pleaded. "I want to watch you work. I want to hang out with you." "No," said Davis firmly. "You have to be on the field." So the young lineman ran to the locker room, got into uniform, pulling the jersey over a big cast that was protecting 4 broken bones in his hand. And that's how Al Davis first became acquainted with a man named Bill Parcells. Parcells long remembered that a big thing with Al, even in those days, was something that Al always told him. Never lose focus of what your responsibility is. And your basic responsibility is not to make any excuses. You can always pick out excuses, a different one each year if you want. You just keep your eye on the eagle. 1963 was a dream year for the Raiders, for Al Davis, and for the city of Oakland. The season solidified the team with the community, and great things were now visible on the horizon. There was no championship that year, but there was a championship feeling. In our next episode, we'll examine how Al Davis spun that momentum for the team, for the city, and for the league. And we'll also see the beginning of a connection between Al Davis and the city of Las Vegas, which is now the home of the Raiders. Once again, I'd like to give credit to Murray Olderman, Ken Rappaport, Jim Otto, and also Michael McCambridge in NFL Films for a lot of the information on this episode. I would also like to credit Steve Travers, author of the book Oakland Raiders, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, as well as Coach Tom Flores and Mac Fulks and their book Tales from the Oakland Raiders. Thank you for tuning in, and make sure to subscribe to my channel and go back and catch any of the previous episodes you may have missed. And share it with a friend. Until next time, this is T3 Raider Facts, reminding you that passion always outlives fashion, and wishing you a bright silver moon shining in the dark black night.